nowadays, when people think about the Welsh Marches, then it's often in terms of an area that straddles the border in North Herefordshire and South Shropshire. An area that is often called picturesque, although as I look up and look out of my window and see the rain lashing down and the tops of the trees swaying from side to side, it's not quite so picturesque today. But the medieval Marcher Lordships formed a much larger area, as you can see on this map, extending from the North Wales coast and the Dee estuary all the way down the English-Welsh border, down to the Severn estuary in the Bristol Channel, and all the way across to the southwest to Pembrokeshire. So an extensive area of land, much more extensive than the area that people now think of as the Welsh Marches. I will just be talking briefly to give an overview and talking about the context in which the Marcher Lordships developed, because I think that an understanding of the position in Wales for 1066 and the situations that faced the Normans after their conquest of England, and how that then developed through to the Edwardian conquest of Wales, is important to understanding the nature of the Marcher Lordships. I'll then talk about the different ways in which the Marcher Lordships emerged, because that was not uniform and again is important to our understanding. And then just finish by briefly describing the regal-like, royal-like powers of the Marcher Lords. So just to very quickly sketch in that context of Wales before 1066 and to understand the situation that the Normans came into and which shaped and moulded their approach to relationships with Wales. As we all know, Wales is a land that is geographically divided and fragmented, with mountainous interiors divided by river valleys, with fertile plains on the borders, with England and around the coast. And as we know from our own experience now, but even more so 1,000 years ago, travel across Wales, particularly from south to north, was and still is extremely difficult. And so that geographical fragmentation was one of the factors that blocked moves towards the formation of a more unified Welsh kingdom across Europe and particularly in England during the 9th and 10th centuries. Then there were moves towards more unified kingdoms, and as you know, during the course of the 10th century, a unified Kingdom of England emerged. That didn't happen in Wales for a number of reasons, but one of which was it was blocked or obstructed by the geographical fragmentation. But over the centuries after the Romans had left Britain, the myriad of small kingdoms in Wales gradually consolidated through war, through marriage, into 4 main blocks. I refer to them as sort of blocks of power because their boundaries were forever fluid and changing, which is why I've made no attempt on this map to draw those boundaries. But in the sort of by the 11th century, then 4 main kingdoms, blocks of power had emerged: Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the central area, although at this time Powys had been subsumed into Gwynedd, although it was to become separate again in the southwest to Rhybarth and Morgannwg. During the 9th and 10th centuries, powerful rulers had periodically established their rule over most of or all of Wales, but this had never survived their death. However, the most recent example of this has been the career of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the Prince of Gwynedd and Powys, who by very violent means established his rule across all of Wales. But he met a violent end and was killed in 1063. But that very recent experience no doubt shaped the Normans' approach to Wales. The other part of the context is the sort of background of relationships between the Anglo-Saxons of England and relationships with the Welsh. Although there was repeated conflict in the border regions, there had been no desire by kings of England to conquer Wales. A complex pattern of alliances between Welsh kings allying with Anglo-Saxon earls and the crown for support in internal feuds in Wales, and also vice versa. And often, and particularly from the reign of Alfred of Wessex onwards, Welsh kings sought and accepted the protection and overlordship of Alfred of Wessex and his successors, and later the kings of England. And the other thing just to quickly mention is again, it's very difficult to demark a boundary. The boundary was fluid, forever moving backwards and forwards. Offa's Dyke was never a boundary, it was a barrier to prevent military raids. There was always Welsh settlement to the east of Offa's Dyke and Anglo-Saxon settlement well to the west of Offa's Dyke. And so it was a very fluid boundary. So that was the context which the Normans came into when, after their conquest of England and the Battle of Hastings, that followed the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now, during a period of about 4 years, the Normans stamped their authority across all of England. But Wales was to be different for a number of reasons. With lands that span the English Channel, the priorities of the Norman and their successors, the Anglo-Norman kings, lay elsewhere. Also, the political diversity in Wales, the number of kingdoms, allied to the fragmented mountainous topography, made conquest hugely expensive, as any conquest would need to be waged on a number of fronts. Whereas at Hastings, the Normans could defeat the Anglo-Saxon army, kill King Harold, and having achieved that, march on London and William be conquered. Much more complicated in Wales, where there were any number of princes and kingdoms to be defeated. So it would require huge amounts of time, resources, and money and power. As I said, the Normans would have been aware of that very recent domination secured across Wales by Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, and the threat that he had posed to the security of the border regions and the raids that had happened, Hereford being a particular target. So William the Conqueror, one of his first steps was to establish 3 powerful earldoms based at Chester, Shrewsbury and Hereford, and entrusted those to his most loyal companions. And they in turn established their own knights in the lands surrounding Chester, Shrewsbury and Hereford, providing a buffer between those centres and the lands of the Welsh. But although conquest of the whole country would be incredibly time-consuming and expensive, of course, if we go back to the earlier map showing the topography, the low-lying lands on the border with England and across the south coast were easily open to encroachment from England and an obvious target for land-hungry Normans and acquisitive land-hungry Normans to acquire more land. And so again, the topography is one of the factors that shaped the development of the Marcher Lordships. So what began to develop was as the Normans began to encroach into Wales and to conquer and take for themselves lands on the borders with England and along the south coast. They developed an area of mainly Welsh rule that became referred to as, and the Welsh speakers, please forgive my attempts, became referred to as Pura Walia in the north and down the east, with blocks of land referred to as Marcher Wali. But obviously the boundaries between the two were forever fluid and moving south, north, east, west. And often those the sort of balance of power that swung back and forth was dependent on the power, the personality of individual monarchs, the circumstances elsewhere in their extensive lands, and the strength and power of Welsh princes, and whether there were dominant rulers in Wales. So a very simple example is if we take the period of the reign of King Stephen in the 1130s to 1150s, which, as you're all, I'm sure, well aware, Stephen's reign was dominated by the civil wars, with his throne being contested by the Empress Matilda, and the marches were often a focus of that of the anarchy and the civil wars, as the bedrock of Matilda's support was from Gloucester and emanating up through the marches. But a consequence partly of Stephen's own character, but also the distraction of the civil wars. Then Stephen had no time to give attention to Wales, and so consequently that period is dominated by an uprising of Welsh power and pushing back the Norman incursions. And so that sort of period of power and sort of control moving backwards and forwards continued. But during the 13th century, circumstances began to change. In part, one of the factors was the loss of the Plantagenet Empire on the continent during the reign of King John, and that loss, because during the reign of Henry II in the 12th century, the Plantagenet Empire had extended from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees and the borders with Spain, a huge territory, I mean, huge by standards now, and travel from one end to the other, time-consuming now, even more so 900 years ago. But the loss of that huge empire for the first time, focused the attention of the crown onto Britain. The other thing that began to change during the 13th century was as a result of two remarkable princes in Wales. First, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Prince of Gwynedd, who from about 1200 to his death in 1240 established a personal rule across and a dominance across all of Wales. And then that was followed by his grandson, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who was recognised in the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 as the Prince of Wales. And so the rise of these powerful princes ruling across all of Wales increased the potential threat from Wales. So whereas in the 12th century, English kings had been able to exercise the control that they needed in Wales through exercising their overlordship of Welsh princes, with the occasional military expeditions to remind people where power lay, that was changing. And then the final, part of the equation was the death of Henry III in 1222, to be followed by his heir Edward I, who, on the death of his father, was away on the Crusades, but on his return was crowned in 1274. And so you can see the circumstances were moving to inevitable conflict between England and Wales. And so Edward determined on a final settlement in regards to Wales, and across two campaigns, which are referred to as the Edwardian Conquest of Wales in 1277 and in 1282-1283, Edward I established that conquest of Wales, and through the Statute of Wales in 1284 established the governance structures of the Principality of Wales, and acknowledged the structure of the Marcher Lordships as an area that lay between England and Wales, an area that was not part, structurally, administrative, legally, was not part of Wales, nor was it fully part of England. So this map that I've been showing is a map that shows the extent of the Marcher Lordships that was achieved after the final conquest. So I'll just talk briefly now about the different ways in which the Marcher Lordships were formed. Because out of that 200 years or so of conflict, balances of power, influence and power moving backwards and forwards, then the Marcher Lordships did not emerge in a uniform way. There are four clear distinctions between how they developed. So, first of all, are the lands that were conquered in the late 11th and early 12th century, where the lordships that were formed from those early conquests remained mainly in Anglo-Norman control. And so those are the areas marked grey on the map, mainly in the sort of southeast boundary with England and spanning those fertile coastal plains across the south of Wales and to Pembrokeshire in the southwest. And that was classically summed up by Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, Lord of Glamorgan, when in the 1270s the Crown had established a quo warranto process to investigate the nobles' claim to their lands and franchises. Then Gilbert's response was, "Here, my lords, here is my warrant. My ancestors came with William the Bastard and conquered their lands with the sword, and I shall defend them with the sword against anyone who tries to usurp them." In stark contrast to that, though, are a series of Marcher Lordships, which are coloured orange on this map. So the ones spanning from Oswestry down to Wigmore itself and to Clifford. And these were lordships that at the start of our period, in the 11th, early 12th century, were lordships that were firmly in England part of the county administrative and judicial structures. But during our period, they were withdrawn from the shires of England, withdrawn into the March, with the lords claiming Marcher status and Marcher powers. Typically in Oswestry and Clun, the Fitzalan family used periods of weakness of the crown in the late 12th century, early 13th century to withdraw Oswestry and Clun into the March and withdraw them from the administrative structure of the county of Shropshire. A little bit later, Roger Mortimer used his friendship with the Lord Edward to be Edward I. In the aftermath of the Battle of Evesham, in the years after the Battle of Evesham, he used his friendship to withdraw Wigmore from the jurisdiction of Herefordshire and into the March. And 30 years later, his son Edmund Mortimer resisted the collection of taxes from his lordship of Wigmore, but not from his lands in Shropshire, on the basis that his tenants in Wigmore did not answer the summons of the itinerant justices, that the king's writ did not run there, and jurisdiction belonged solely to the Lord of the Liberty, and had done so from time immemorial. Not true. Wigmore had been a Marcher lordship from only 30 years before in the lifetime of his grandfather. But interestingly, it is often the lords of those Marcher lordships that were withdrawn into the March who were most strident and most forceful in proclaiming their rights as Marcher lords. And again, the classic example is Walter Clifford, Lord of Clifford, who, on receiving a writ from the king, forced the messenger to eat the king's document, wax seal and all. Then there are a block of Marcher lordships that are shaded green on this map, mainly in the central area, but a few elsewhere, that were conquered early in the end of the 11th century, early 12th century, but which were then reconquered by the Welsh, and control swung backwards and forwards, being conquered and reconquered for 200 years. So, for example, Mylyneth, which was just to the west of Wigmore and therefore a target of the Mortimers, it was conquered by the Mortimers in about the 1090s, but during the subsequent 200 years, it was held for, the Mortimers actually held it for only about 80 years, and there was Welsh rule for the remaining periods. And then finally, there is a swathe of lordships that are coloured pink on this map, mainly in the northeast, which after the Edwardian conquest of Wales in 1282, 1283, Edward I created further Marcher lordships and awarded those to his loyal supporters and commanders, again including Roger Mortimer, who was awarded Kerry and Kedwain to consolidate the Marcher hold over the central marches, but also Chirk, that was awarded to his younger son, who became Roger of Chirk, and interestingly Powys, which became the only Marcher lordship that was granted to the existing Welsh princes. So I've got a few minutes left, so just quickly summarise some of the remarkable powers that accrued to the Marcher lords. One of the most well-known powers was they had to, and originating from the military necessities of the March, the Marcher lords had the rights to build their own castles without acquiring a license from the king, and that is part of the explanation of why this area has so many castles. You're tripping them over them every few miles. But also Marcher lords could raise their own armies to settle disputes with other Marcher lords and with the native princes of Wales. And many fine castles were built across the marches. This wonderful reconstruction drawing by Chris Jones-Jenkins, who is with us today, is of the Ruthin Castle in what is now Denbighshire. The Marcher Lords, and this became increasingly important. The Marcher Lords had all judicial powers within their lordships. It was the Marcher Lord, not the king, who was responsible for the law, the judicial structure, the exercise of justice, including right to gallows. And they also had the rights of taxation within their lordships that were normally exercised by the king elsewhere. And these were highly lucrative powers because obviously the money raised by the taxation, money raised from fines of the courts, went into the Marcher Lords' coffers, not to the sheriffs of the shires, and from there to the king. Extensive powers of commerce to create boroughs and to levy tolls, to create forests with forest laws, establish mines, and I think one of the more interesting, the right to capture royal fish such as porpoises or sturgeon. And this one looks as though it's about to come to quite a brutal end. I'll just quickly go back. The Marcher Lords jealously guarded their judicial rights. One example is when Edmund Mortimer executed a criminal from Montgomery and had him hung. Montgomery was a royal lordship under the control of Edward I, and Edward I was took such umbrage that Edmund Mortimer had dared to hang somebody from his own lordship, even though well guilty, that Edward I fined Edmund Mortimer and made Edmund Mortimer create an effigy of that criminal so that he could hang that effigy in Montgomery. So just to quickly conclude, as I mentioned before, the Edwardian conquest of Wales brought the Marcher Lord, created the sort of more static structure of the Marcher Lordships that we are familiar with now. And they existed more or less in this form for nearly 300 years. In some cases, with the settlement of Wales, their military significance had disappeared and they became rural backwaters. Though many continued as important administrative centres, but all provided wealth and power, so were much sought after. And increasingly, what began to happen was that the control ownership of the Marcher Lordships consolidated into the hands of fewer and fewer lords. And so this map gives you a sense of that process. So just to highlight the Mortimers, the Mortimer Lordships, and this is sort of at about the second half of the 14th century, when the Mortimers were beginning to control something like a third of all Marcher Lordships. And so they were consolidating into the hands of fewer and fewer families. But increasingly, the lordships were being seen as an anachronism and outdated. And particular concern that the fragmentation of judicial systems across the Principality and the Marcher Lordships was a cause of increasing perception of crime and lawlessness. So by the late 15th century, moving into the 16th century, there was this view of Wales and the Marchers as utterly lawless, crime-ridden and violent. And the blame for that was this fragmentation of judicial systems, with each Marcher Lord running their own judicial system and the Principality of Wales. So eventually, the powers of the Marcher Lords were abolished by the Laws and Wales Acts of 1536 and 1542, which incorporated the lands into the new counties of Wales or into the border counties of England. So a quick reminder again, please do, if you're interested, pre-order the book.